It has been tradition to believe that the original Olin was a young Welsh boy named John who was impressed into service on a British man-of-war about 1678 at Cardiff, Wales. Only 14 years old at the time, John served as a powder monkey or cabin boy. When the ship landed at Boston Harbor in the Massachusetts colony later the same year, John Olin jumped ship for a free life. John Olin married Susanna Spencer in 1708. Her parents had immigrated from Wales. John and Susanna lived in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, where they raised their family of 3 sons and 1 daughter. Second generation Joseph, John, Henry, and Eleanor. 4 books have been published on the history of the Olin family in America. The first book was written by George S. Nye in 1892 and traced the second generation John Olin branch. In 1893, C.C. Olin wrote a book primarily on the second generation Henry branch. Orrin Raber followed up on the John branch in 1922, and William Closen continued the Henry branch in 1956. Although there is still no history of the second generation Eleanor branch, Warren G. Olin has researched the Joseph Olin branch. This is the Olin family from Joseph to about his 7th generation descendants. Second generation Joseph Olin, born August 29, 1710, to John and Susanna Olin in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. At the age of 24, he was admitted a free man in the colony. A free man was considered a citizen who had religious, political, and civil liberties. 1 year later, May 18, 1735, Joseph Olin married Mary Aylesworth, and they raised a family of 10 children, as shown on the chart. Our story will continue with the 2 third-generation sons, Joseph and Philip. Philip Olin went to Connecticut, where he met and married Mary Green of New London, Connecticut. They had 9 children, one of which was 4th generation Benjamin Olin, who married Sally Bond and had 13 children. We have followed 2 of Benjamin's children. First, 5th generation John Olin to 6th generation Martin Olin to 7th generation George W. Olin, to find 8th generation Dorothy Olin Strong, who resides in Oswego, New York. Secondly, 5th generation Benjamin Olin to 6th generation Russell Olin to 7th generation Benjamin S. Olin to 8th generation Lloyd Olin, whose son Stephen lives in Mexico, New York. Going back to 3rd generation Joseph Olin, born in 1740 in Rhode Island, we find very little information. All we know is that his wife's name at the time of his death was Sarah. We have no record of a marriage or of any children in Rhode Island, but a Rhode Island census taken in 1774 lists Joseph Olin of Scituate as head of household. Joseph migrated to Guilford, Vermont about 1780, where he purchased several acres of land and sold or gave small parcels to his children. He was elected to and served as fence viewer, hog constable, and surveyors of highways. As we mentioned before, we were unable to find positive proof of Joseph Olin or Oldin's wife Sarah's last name or birth of their children. However, census information and old correspondence indicates that there were at least 2 sons, 4th generation Joseph Jr. and Reuben Olin or Olin. It is interesting to note that Olin was not spelled consistently until around 1830. We believe that there are families of today that were originally Olin who have stayed with the Olin surname. Our research has found 16 different variations on the spelling of Olin, the most common being Olden, Odin, Older, and Olen. Fourth generation Joseph Jr. married Leah Cudworth in 1786. He had his own farm in Guilford, Vermont until 1796, when he bought property and moved to Whittenham, Vermont, about 20 miles west of Guilford. Some Joseph Olin descendants have kept the name Olin and others Olden. Joseph and Leah had several daughters who married locally. One son, fifth generation Caleb, migrated westward with his family, first to the St. Lawrence River Valley in New York State, and then on to Portland, Michigan. Other sons stayed in the southern Vermont and northern Massachusetts area and used the spelling Olden. Fourth generation Reuben, brother to Joseph, was born in 1775 in Rhode Island and married Hannah Nichols in Guilford, Vermont. His father deeded 50 acres to them in 1801 from the original farm. Reuben and Hannah had 9 children, all born under the same roof. These children were born in the early years of American independence, when East Coast states were becoming congested, the western frontier was open for settlers, and freedom of worship actually had come into existence. It was inevitable that Reuben and Hannah's children, exposed to this new freedom, would seek adventure and accomplishment. Fifth generation Charles received his call to serve the Lord at an early age and preached the gospel throughout New Hampshire until his death. He had 2 sons, sixth generation Charles Jr., who never married and who stayed at home to take care of the family while his father served in the Civil War, and sixth generation John F., who was married to the same woman 70 years and lived to be 96 years old. John first worked as an iron smelter, joined the ministry to fulfill his father's dying wish, owned a general merchandise store, became the local postmaster, and wrote poetry. He spent most of his life in Lyman, New Hampshire. The Reverend and Mrs. John F. Olin had 2 children, 7th generation Myrtle, who married William Stevens, and 7th generation Clayton, who married Susie Mace. They each had 1 child, 8th generation Cleland Stevens and 8th generation Ruth Olin, the latter of whom married Norman Fox. 2 of 4th generation Reuben's daughters died early and are buried in one of the 2 cemeteries near the farm in Guilford, Vermont. The markers are very clear for both 5th generation Rachel and Ruth in the Stark Cemetery. 5th generation daughter Nancy married Arid Shearer of Coleraine, Massachusetts. Nothing has been found out about another daughter, 5th generation Sally. 5th generation brothers George and Calvin, along with their sister Lucinda, were reported to have gone west to Wisconsin. Our research shows Calvin owning a farm in 1841 near Davenport in Delaware County, New York. He left New York for Wisconsin in 1843. His brother, George, was in Wisconsin about the same time, but did not stay long. George went on to Iowa, where there were no trees, built a sod house, and 3 years later returned to Wisconsin, where he had a farm with lots of trees to use. George was active as a farmer, politician, and protector from the Indians. Both Calvin's and George's family spread out from Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Trace of their sister, Lucinda, is lost during this migration period. 4th generation Reuben and Hannah's oldest son, 5th generation John, born in 1802 in Guilford, Vermont, married Ruth Culver in Guilford in 1826. Shortly after his marriage, he moved to the town of Johnsburg, Warren County, New York. He purchased a 65-acre farm 5 miles north of North Creek on the barren and rocky headwaters of the Hudson River. His taxes were 60 cents a year. Their first daughter, 6th generation Jane, and the first son, Hyde, were born here. John and Ruth were probably discouraged with their farmland conditions, and in 1835 they sold out and moved to Franklin, Delaware County, New York. We suspect that they may have rented a farm. Their second son, Earl, was born here. John and Ruth moved again about 1839, this time to a farm on Slocum Hill, Jackson, in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, where their last 2 children, 6th generation Irene and Omar, were born. The move to Jackson was deliberate, as several families from Guilford, Vermont, had already moved to Jackson, such familiar families as Culver, Benson, Thayer, Nichols, and so on. John had a lot of work to make things livable for his family. First, he replaced an old log cabin with a small frame house. He picked stones from his field to build stone fences and foundations for his outbuildings. This stone removal and the clearing of trees for his buildings and firewood gave him the opportunity to plant a sizable apple orchard. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, John and his son Omar were very successful and highly respected farmers, known for their apple orchards and breeding of fine horses and cattle. John was also a first-rate carpenter. He and Roswell Culver built the Jackson Hotel, which burned down about 1920, a store, a house that contained the post office during the Civil War, a church, and several other houses and barns around Jackson. John and Ruth's oldest daughter, 6th generation Jane, was never married and lived at home with her parents. She died at the early age of 38 and was buried in the Olin family plot in the Jackson Baptist Cemetery. John and Ruth's oldest son, 6th generation Hyde, married Maria Nicholas at his father's farm. They had 2 daughters, 7th generation Adelia, who married Charles Lewis in New York State, and 7th generation Hattie, who married Crosby Moffett and moved to Binghamton, New York. Shortly after the birth of his 2 daughters, Hyde enlisted in the Pennsylvania Infantry for the Army of the North. During the Civil War, he was seriously wounded in the siege of Richmond and died in 1864 of pneumonia in an Army hospital at Old Point Comfort in eastern Virginia. Hyde Olin's name is listed on the Civil War monument in the Village Park in Montrose, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. John and Ruth's second son, 6th generation Earl, married Abigail Carpenter and lived on a small farm east on the crossroad from his father's farm. This farm was originally settled by Simon Slocum, and its house stands today. 6th generation Earl and Abigail had 2 children, Edna and Orva. Edna married Louis Burdick and died while giving birth to a daughter, who also died 3 years later. Earl died at the young age of 37. It should be noted that Abigail Carpenter Olin's grandfather was Obadiah Carpenter, a Revolutionary War veteran. This could qualify the descendants of Earl and Abigail for membership in the DAR. Earl and Abigail's son, 7th generation Orva, was married twice. The first marriage was to Ida Corey, and they had 3 sons, 8th generation Earl, George, and Russell, prior to her death in 1896. Ida made this beautiful crazy quilt in 1894. She apparently was assisted by other family members and neighbors in the design and stitching, as indicated by the sewn-in names and initials. Orva's second marriage was to Nettie Estabrook, and they had 3 children, 8th generation Edna, Wanda, and LeGrand, all of whom died before they reached the age of 33. Nettie was recognized as a shrewd businesswoman. Orva and Nettie owned several pieces of property in Endicott, as well as their home and farms throughout Susquehanna County. Orva was a carpenter by trade and made this tool chest during his teen years as an apprentice carpenter. The chest still contains his original carpenter tools and some stone cutting tools that he used during his stone quarrying attempts. Orva not only assisted in building houses around Susquehanna County, but he was foreman of the carpenters employed to build the Endicott-Johnson shoe manufacturing complex in Endicott, New York. Around 1903, Orva and Colonel Benson, a cousin by marriage and also a skilled carpenter, established a business in Endicott and called it the Olin and Benson Planing Mill, finishers of fine lumber. 3 years later, they sold the business to Endicott-Johnson Shoe Company to meet that company's growth requirements. 6th generation Irene was the youngest daughter of John and Ruth Olin, and she married Ashale Lau from Jackson. Ashale was born Ashale Card and was adopted by the Lau family. They had a family of 6, 5 boys and 1 girl. 7th generation John Franklin Lau married May Spangenberg and had a daughter, 8th generation Lila Rose. Frank Lau gained possession of the original John Olin farm from his cousin, Minnie Olin Snyder, during the 1920s. He died in 1929, and the farm left the Olin family. 7th generation Edward married Alice Welton, and they had 2 sons, 8th generation Laverne and Arthur. Edward Lau was employed by the Delaware and Hudson Railroad for most of his working life and died in the Oneonta Hospital as a result of an accident on the job. 7th generation Charles Lau, the whiskered one, as some of us remember him, married Mary Welton, and they had 2 daughters, 8th generation Florence and Bertha. Charlie was a hunter and trapper and had a large collection of guns. 7th generation Rose married John Stockwell and had 1 child, Alma. 7th generation Leon was first married to Ethel Brown, and they had 2 children, 8th generation Leona and Burl. 2 years after the birth of Burl, Ethel Brown Lau died. Leon married Nellie Clearwater, and they had no children. John and Ruth Olin's youngest child was 6th generation Omar, who married Althea Bloxham from Ararat, whose parents came directly from England to Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. Omar continued to live at his father's farm and took care of his parents until their death. His management of the apple orchards and breeding of fancy horses and cattle provided his family with the means to live well and established his respective social position in Susquehanna County. 6th generation Omar and Althea had 4 daughters. The oldest, Lizzie, died when she was 3 years old. Carrie married Colonel Benson, whom we mentioned before as an excellent carpenter and cabinet maker. They had 2 daughters, 8th generation Thelma and Corinne. Here we see Thelma proudly showing some of the furniture handcrafted by her father. He made 2 grandfather clocks, 1 for each daughter. 7th generation Daisy, another daughter of Omar and Althea, married Robert Sparks and lived on a farm near her parents on Slocum Hill. The Sparks family had a mill in Jackson, which later became a machine repair shop. They had one son, 8th generation Kenneth, who made his living as a traveling repairman for highway construction equipment. Omar and Althea's youngest daughter, 7th generation Minnie, remained at home to take care of her parents. After they passed away, Minnie married Ralph Snyder, a local school teacher. They spent a few years on the farm and then sold it to Minnie's cousin, Frank Lau. Minnie and Ralph moved to New Jersey, where he worked for an insurance company. They raised 4 daughters, 8th generation Gertrude, Althea, Dorothy, and Eileen. For a moment, let us go back 100 years to the late 1800s and early 1900s and take a look at Jackson, Pennsylvania, and some of its history as it relates to the Olin family. F.B. Lamb, a past resident of Slocum Hill, drew this map in 1881. He has identified all the neighboring families on Slocum Hill. Some family names, such as Pickering, Benson, Brown, and Slocum, are still around today. Snake Hill Road has been rerouted at least twice because of storm washouts, and several of the landmark buildings are no longer standing. If we stand at Jackson's Four Corners and look east, we can see the Snake Hill Road leading to Slocum Hill, where our Pennsylvanian John Olin had his farm. If we look to our right, or south, we see the road that goes past the Lamb Cemetery and on to Gillette, Pennsylvania, whose cemetery contains the Sparks family ancestors. Looking to our left, we see Jackson's Main Street. This is where 3 generations of Olins earned respect for their skills and their participation in local politics, church activities, and service on school boards. This is how it looked about 1900. Omar Olin was on the school board that governed 10 one-room school districts. He was also an official of the Jackson Baptist Church, which we see here. Behind the church is the cemetery that contains John Olin and most of his family, Omar and most of his family, and Orva's second family. Orva lived in a house close to the Baptist church. In his later years, Orva became known as a water dowser, as he helped families locate fresh water using a forked branch from a peach tree. Ralph Snyder taught in at least 2 school districts, including one here on Main Street. Continuing north, we come to North Jackson, where the present Methodist Church and the North Jackson Cemetery are located. Several descendants of the Corey and Estabrook families are buried here. Returning now to the Four Corners in Jackson, we will start following Snake Hill Road to Slocum Hill. At the foot of the hill, a small stream crossing under the road supported a milling operation on our left, which was owned and operated by the Sparks family. It was later converted to a machine repair shop. Their house is still standing across the creek road from the mill. Farther up the road on the right, we can see evidence of an abandoned road and a very small creek. This road was one of the original routes up the hill, and it passed between the Olin farmhouse and outbuildings. The beginning of the small creek, or brook, is a large, flowing, sweet water spring. This spring supplied water to the Olin and Sparks households and to a watering trough along the road. The pipes used to convey the water have gone through 4 eras of technology: wood, lead, iron, and plastic. Natural gravity flow was used for the downhill water supplied to the water trough and to the Sparks. John Olin installed a wooden ram at the spring to force water up to a cistern in the attic of his house. When John first settled his family on this farm, they were crowded into a small log cabin. He immediately raised a frame house which was later replaced with a much larger frame house. The smaller one was moved across the road and used as a machine and tool shed. Later on, his son Omar added more rooms and a front porch to the larger house. This house was struck by lightning, burned to the ground, and was replaced by the present house that you see here. We are now back on the present Snake Hill Road, which winds its way up 300 yards left of the Olin buildings, where there is still evidence of apple orchards, cleared meadows, and stone wall fences. As we turn right on this crossroad, notice the large basswood tree, the beautifully built fence of stone, and the evidence of the other end of the original Snake Hill Road, which came up the hill between the Olin house and outbuildings. On the right is the site of Jackson No. 2 Schoolhouse, where Ralph Snyder taught prior to his marriage to Minnie Olin. A local native, Raymond Pickering, recalls plowing under what remains of the old school foundation. Further on, we see the site of Simon Slocum's home, the original settler on this hill. This is the same farm where John's son Earl and his bride, Abigail Carpenter, lived, and where their children, Edna and Orva, were born and raised. Next door was the farm of Job Benson, one of the original Benson brothers who came to Susquehanna County, and the ancestor of our colonel, known as Kern, Benson family. We are now back on the present Snake Hill Road, continuing east toward Thompson. On our right is a barn which stands alone. It replaces the original barn that was once a part of John and Omar Olin's farm. Upon their marriage, Robert Sparks and Omar's daughter Daisy lived on the farm, which became known as the Sparks Farm. Notice the stone walls on both sides of the road. It took the farmers of Slocum Hill thousands of hours to pick the stones, haul them to the edges of the fields, and painstakingly build fences of stone that served over the years as farm line boundaries and livestock fences. When the decision was made to macadam Snake Hill Road, almost all the stone walls on Slocum Hill were torn down, hauled to the road site, broken up by hand, and spread out as the base for the asphalt top. We continue through the Raymond and Gladys Harding Pickering farm with their farm equipment sales business and turn right again. This cemetery is known as the East Jackson Cemetery and contains some of our Lau ancestors. John Olin's daughter Irene married a Shale Lau. Other Lau descendants are buried in cemeteries at Franklin, Delaware County, New York, and Milford or Skenevis in Otsego County, New York. Two other cemeteries should be noted at this time. The Evergreen Cemetery in Susquehanna has more of our Bensons, and the Floral Park Cemetery in Johnson City, New York, contains the Moffett and Hakes family, who were descendants of John's son, Hyde. This has been a quick summary of the 7 generations from 1700 to 1900 of the second generation Joseph Olin branch. Other tapes under consideration are the Olins of the 20th century, Olin origin before 1700, and the expanded Olin story of the other branches descended from second generation Joseph Olin. We hope that you have found this story of the Olin family from 1700 to 1900 to be both informative and interesting. For further information, write to Warren Olin, RD3, Box 59, Owego, New York, 13827.